It was supposed to be the happiest day of their lives. June 15, 1985, a warm summer afternoon in rural Georgia. Friends and family gathered outside the white-pillared mansion that served as the wedding venue, surrounded by blooming roses and the buzz of celebration. Photos show a young couple beaming with joy. Lisa Mayfield, 23, in a simple but elegant white gown, and her new husband, Daniel Whitaker, 25, dressed sharp in a cream tuxedo. Standing arm in arm beside a bright yellow convertible decorated with flowers and ribbons. It looked like a moment frozen in time. Two young hearts starting a life together filled with hope and endless possibilities. But that moment would be the last anyone ever saw of them, after tossing the bouquet and saying their goodbyes. Lisa and Daniel drove off in that yellow convertible, waving to family, laughing as the tin cans tied to the bumper clattered against the road. They were heading to a lakeside cabin for a quiet honeymoon just 2 hours away. They never made it. No one ever heard from them again. At first, people assumed they got lost or delayed. Maybe they wanted time away from everyone, some speculated. But when neither of them showed up at the cabin and their families couldn't reach them by phone, which at the time meant days of waiting and worrying, panic slowly set in. Police were called. A search was launched. Roads were combed, rivers checked, flyers posted, and locals questioned. But there was nothing. Not a single sign. It was like the couple had driven off into thin air. The case puzzled investigators for years. There was no foul play at the wedding, no enemies, no known reason for either Lisa or Daniel to run away. The couple had been together since high school, and by all accounts, they were madly in love. Both families were respected in their small town, and neither had any financial troubles or suspicious dealings. Even more confusing, the couple's suitcases and honeymoon plans had all been made in advance. Lisa had even sent a postcard to a friend talking about how excited she was for the trip. But then, nothing. The postcard arrived, but Lisa and Daniel did not. As months passed, the story faded from the headlines. The families kept hoping, kept waiting. Holidays came and went. Birthdays passed, and then years. 12 long years. Rumors swirled that they had eloped to another country, that Daniel had gotten into something shady, that maybe someone close to them knew more than they were saying. But with no car, no bodies, and no evidence, it was all just talk. Cold cases like this often die in silence, but not this one. In 1997, something strange happened. A local man was browsing satellite imagery online, still a novelty at the time, when he noticed something odd on the edge of a retention pond near an old unused property not far from where Lisa and Daniel were last seen. At first, it looked like just a dark patch in the water. But when he zoomed in, the outline of a car, a very distinct, old-fashioned shape, could just barely be made out beneath the surface. He reported it to the authorities, not thinking much would come of it. But when the police arrived at the pond and began investigating, what they found would reopen a mystery that had haunted two families for over a decade. Divers entered the murky water. Within hours, they located the vehicle. It was a yellow 1957 Ford Thunderbird, just like the one Daniel had proudly restored before the wedding. Still mostly intact, still with the same floral ribbon wrapped around the rearview mirror. Inside, to everyone's shock and heartbreak, were the remains of two people. One male, one female, still seated, seatbelts on. The water had preserved more than anyone expected. Suddenly, a story that had gone silent for 12 years came rushing back into the light. The discovery left everyone shaken, not just because of what was found, but because of how it had stayed hidden for so long, in a place that, somehow, had never been searched. Even worse, what led to that discovery wasn't some breakthrough in forensics or new witness testimony. It was a grainy image taken from hundreds of miles above Earth, a satellite photo that changed Everything but the discovery of the car was just the beginning. As forensic teams worked to confirm the identities of the remains, more questions began to emerge. How did the car end up in that pond? Why wasn't it found earlier? And most chilling of all, did they drive in by accident, or did someone make sure they never made it out? The families, after all these years, had only just begun to accept that Lisa and Daniel might never be found. Now they were faced with a flood of new emotions: grief, relief, confusion, and a desperate need for answers. For many in the town, it felt like reopening an old wound. For the investigators, it was a rare second chance. A cold case, suddenly warm again. And yet, even with the car found and the bodies recovered, so much still didn't make sense. The road leading to the pond was narrow and unpaved, barely visible even in daylight. Lisa and Daniel would have had to drive through overgrown brush and miss multiple signs to end up there. There were no skid marks, no signs of a struggle, no calls for help. It was as if they had simply veered off course and vanished. But those who knew them, those who remembered their joyful wedding day, that beaming photo by the yellow car, refused to believe it was just a tragic accident. The more people started digging into the case again, the more small inconsistencies began to surface. A neighbor who thought they heard a scream that night but didn't want to get involved. A wedding guest who recalled a strange man watching the couple from across the street. An old diary entry from Lisa that hinted she was worried about something or someone. Now, nearly 4 decades later, we return to the mystery that has haunted this quiet southern town. A case of love, loss, and a long-forgotten secret buried beneath the surface, quite literally. In this video, we'll retrace the couple's final steps, examine what was found inside that car, and reveal the chilling theory that may finally explain what really happened to Lisa and Daniel on the night of their wedding, because sometimes the past doesn't stay buried. Sometimes the truth is only visible from far above, and what it reveals changes everything. Daniel Whitaker wasn't just the boy-next-door type. He was well-liked, hard-working, the kind of guy who'd fix your fence without being asked. People in town remembered him cruising around in that yellow Thunderbird, always keeping it spotless. His father owned a small auto shop where Daniel spent most of his weekends. Cars were his passion, and that Thunderbird was his pride. A rare 1957 model he'd restored from the ground up with his dad. Everyone who knew him said he wouldn't have risked it on rough back roads unless he had to. Lisa Mayfield was just as loved, sweet, soft-spoken, but smart. She worked part-time at the library and was known for volunteering at the local church. Teachers still talked about her top grades and how she was planning to study early childhood education. She and Daniel had been high school sweethearts. You know, the kind of couple that makes you believe in fate. They were inseparable, the kind of love you read about in small-town newspapers, and that's exactly where they ended up. Front page of the Oak Ridge Gazette, the morning after their wedding. That was supposed to be the beginning of their story. Done instead. It became a local legend. People talked about them in whispers for years. At every town fair or high school reunion, someone always brought them up. Remember Lisa and Daniel, they'd say? Wonder what really happened to them. Theories ranged from the believable to the downright bizarre. Some believed they swerved to avoid an animal on a dark road and crashed into the water. Others whispered about a jealous ex, a stranger at the wedding, even government conspiracies. One story that stuck for years came from a trucker who swore he saw a yellow car swerving on the highway the night they vanished. But his statement didn't lead anywhere, and nothing ever came of it. What made things worse was how close the pond was to the town. Just a few miles from the main road, behind an old overgrown property once used as farmland. Somehow, over 12 years of searching, no one thought to check it. It was shallow in places, murky with algae and reeds. During the summer, it dried up halfway. But in '85, it would have been full. Still, the question lingered. How could they have ended up there unnoticed. Even stranger were the details uncovered once the car was pulled from the pond. The gear was in neutral. The keys were still in the ignition, turned halfway. There were no signs of panic or an attempt to escape. Both seatbelts were fastened. Their wedding clothes were still intact, though faded and water-damaged. Lisa's veil was draped over her lap, and Daniel's boutonniere still clung to his lapel. It was like time had stopped inside that car. No damage to the exterior suggested a crash. No broken glass, no dents. It was as if someone had gently placed it in the water. The forensic report raised even more questions. Though the remains were too decomposed for a clear cause of death, the lack of trauma suggested drowning. Toxicology couldn't rule out foul play, but it couldn't confirm it either. The only unsettling clue was a faint trace of a sedative found in the tissue samples. Nothing definitive, but enough to give pause. Was it from hospital care, food contamination, or had someone drugged? Police reopened the case, but 12 years had erased many leads. Witness memories had faded, old files were missing, and some of the original investigators had retired. Still, a new generation of detectives took interest. The lead officer at the time, Detective Marla Griggs, was only a rookie in '85. She'd been fresh out of the academy, assigned to assist on the wedding case because she knew Lisa from church. Now, in 1997, she was determined to find out what really happened, if not for the justice system, then for the families who had waited far too long for answers. Marla started by digging back into the wedding guest list. Most people had stayed local, easy to track down. A few had passed away, but many were willing to speak. Some remembered odd details they hadn't thought to share back then. A man in a brown suit no one recognized. A fight in the parking lot between two distant cousins. A photographer who packed up earlier than expected. Small things, maybe nothing. But in a case this cold, every fragment mattered. One guest, a childhood friend of Lisa's named Cheryl, recalled something eerie. She said Lisa had seemed nervous the morning of the wedding. Not cold feet, not doubts about Daniel, but something else. Lisa had apparently mentioned that someone had been calling her late at night in the weeks leading up to the ceremony. The calls were brief, just silence on the line, maybe a breath. Lisa had brushed it off, told Cheryl it was probably a prank. She never told Daniel. At least, not that anyone knew. Marla followed that thread, and when she checked Lisa's old phone records, or what was left of them, she noticed a strange pattern. Several calls to a number that was no longer in service, all placed in the days before the wedding. One call lasted nearly 10 minutes, made late at night just 3 days before they disappeared. That call had never been reported before. And the number? It was traced back to a payphone in a county over located next to a rest stop where a suspicious fire had been reported that same year. The more Marla looked, the more threads began to unravel. Lisa had also once dated someone before Daniel, a boy named Kyle Foster. The relationship was brief and ended amicably, according to Lisa's friends. But Kyle had moved away a year before the wedding, joined a contracting crew working out of state. No one had heard from him in years. Marla tried to track him down, but records were spotty. No Social Security activity after 1992. No employment. He'd seemingly dropped off the map back in Oak Ridge. Rumors started again. People grew quiet when asked about that summer in '85. A few remembered odd encounters, a stranger asking about the couple at a diner days before the wedding. Someone matching Kyle's description seen near the church. None of it could be confirmed. It was like chasing shadows. And then there was the land. The pond where the car was found sat on private property, owned, strangely enough, by a family who'd left town just a few months after the wedding. The land had gone untouched for years. Overgrown, forgotten. No one had questioned it until now. The current owner, an elderly man who'd bought the property for tax reasons, had never even walked the whole area. He had no idea a car was buried under the water. The families of Lisa and Daniel were hesitant to relive it all. They'd spent years grieving, convincing themselves to accept the unknown. Now they were caught in a storm of questions, they thought. Were buried with their children. Lisa's mother refused interviews, while Daniel's brother agreed to speak, and what he said added another layer to the mystery. A week before the wedding, Daniel had told his brother he was thinking of changing their honeymoon plans. Said he'd heard something that made him uncomfortable. When asked what it was, Daniel brushed it off. Just something someone said. Nothing serious. But now, that vague comment meant everything. What did Daniel hear? Who made Lisa feel afraid? Why did they vanish in a place no one thought to look? And how did a satellite image, over a decade later, reveal what everyone else missed? The deeper you look, the darker it gets. And still, the truth remains just out of reach. Detective Marla Griggs stared at the old map pinned to her office wall. Red string traced possible routes Daniel and Lisa could have taken that night. And yellow markers showed all the places searched back in 1985. The pond where the car was found sat frustratingly outside that original radius just beyond the tree line, hidden by wild overgrowth and a collapsed fence. That small gap had swallowed the couple whole for 12 years. It haunted her. She kept replaying that night in her mind. The celebration, the send-off, the roads, the turnoffs, the silence. Something still didn't sit right. She returned to the property where the car had been found, walking slowly around the edge of the pond. The weeds were thick, the mud soft. On the far side, she noticed tire marks faint, nearly erased by time, but not from the 1985 crash. These were recent. Someone had been here. She followed the path to a small clearing where beer bottles, cigarette butts, and footprints suggested people still visited this forgotten place. Teenagers maybe, or someone else. Someone watching. Meanwhile, across town, Cheryl, Lisa's old friend, found herself digging through a box of letters and photos she hadn't touched in years. Memories of late-night phone calls, handwritten notes from Lisa, and a single Polaroid from the rehearsal dinner. What caught her attention wasn't Lisa or Daniel. It was the background. A man standing off to the side, half out of frame, watching them. Cheryl didn't remember him. She showed the photo to Marla. The detective took one look and felt her stomach tighten. The same man had been described by a guest from the wedding, the one in the brown suit, the one no one recognized. Marla had the photo enhanced. Grainy, but the face was just clear enough to start digging. She ran it through old records, public archives, even DMV files. No exact match came up. But then a tip came in from someone claiming to recognize him. A retired bartender who worked near the venue remembered the man as a drifter who passed through town now and then. Quiet, strange eyes, always asked for cash back. Name, unknown. The bartender said he last saw him 2 weeks after the wedding, heading north in a gray van with no plates. Back at the police station, more questions kept surfacing. The old payphone where the strange calls to Lisa had come from had been vandalized in the late 90s, but Marla found maintenance logs. One listed a call on the exact night of the wedding, a 37-minute call to a residence in Oak Ridge. The house belonged to the owner of the farmland near the pond. But that family had claimed they were out of town that weekend. Something didn't add up. As these pieces began to pile up, Marla started connecting dots that had been scattered for years. What if Daniel and Lisa hadn't simply taken a wrong turn? What if someone had lured them off course? If the phone call that night was part of a plan? But why? The couple had no enemies. Nothing to steal, no debts. Nothing made sense unless it wasn't random at all. One subplot that kept resurfacing was Daniel's brief time working for a local construction firm 2 years before the wedding. A coworker of his, Troy Hammond, had been let go after a fight with Daniel. Police records showed it had been serious enough to draw charges, but Daniel had dropped the complaint. No one knew what it was about. Marla found Troy living in a rundown trailer 2 towns over. When she questioned him, he claimed not to remember Daniel. But something in his tone was off. He fidgeted, looked past her like he was holding something back. As she left, a neighbor pulled her aside. The neighbor mentioned seeing Troy come home late the night. Daniel and Lisa vanished, covered in mud, drunk, and muttering about someone getting what they deserved. At the time, it hadn't meant much. But now, with the car found in a nearby pond, it felt different. When Marla tried to bring Troy in for a follow-up, he was gone. Trailer empty. No forwarding address. The investigation was stirring up old ghosts, and some people didn't want the past uncovered. Meanwhile, Lisa's younger sister Rachel, who had been only 13 at the time, began having dreams about that day again. Back then, she'd idolized Lisa, followed her around constantly. She remembered Lisa being worried, but it wasn't just the phone calls. A week before the wedding, Rachel had overheard a late-night conversation between Lisa and someone on the porch. She never saw the person, but Lisa sounded upset. At one point, Lisa had said, "You promised you'd leave us alone." Rachel never told anyone, assuming it was just wedding stress. Now, with the case reopened, she shared that memory, and it added a whole new layer of mystery. Back at the station, Marla was rereading old statements when she came across a name that hadn't been looked into much: Carl Denner, a former sheriff's deputy who had helped direct traffic at the wedding. He'd retired early, moved out west. Curious, she called him. He was hesitant at first, but eventually agreed to talk. Carl admitted something that had never made it into the report, that he'd seen a car following Daniel and Lisa as they left the venue. A dark sedan, no headlights. He'd assumed it was just another guest, but when he looked back minutes later, it was gone. Carl never mentioned it, said no one asked. He didn't think it mattered until now. The tension in Oak Ridge was growing. Word had spread about the satellite photo, the reopened case, and the strange trail of leads. Some locals wanted the truth. Others wanted the past buried again. And some seemed afraid. Even the satellite image that had reignited the search became a topic of debate. How had it gone unnoticed for so long? Who took the photo? It's just a coincidence. Or had someone seen it earlier and chosen not to say anything? As new clues emerged, so did more dead ends. People who once gave statements now refused to talk. Phone numbers were disconnected, records missing. A quiet fear seemed to settle in the town, like the truth was too dangerous to uncover. But Marla couldn't let it go. Not after all this time. Not after seeing that yellow Thunderbird pulled from the water, still holding its secrets. Something had happened that night, something that wasn't an accident, something that involved more people than anyone realized. And the deeper she dug, the more she realized this wasn't just about Daniel and Lisa anymore. It was about what people were willing to hide, and how far someone would go to keep a secret buried. And somewhere out there, someone still knew the whole story. The town of Oak Ridge, once sleepy and content with forgetting, had started buzzing again. Everywhere Marla went, someone had a theory. Someone had a story. But now, the air felt heavier. People weren't just curious, they were nervous. Was in the way conversations stopped when she walked into the diner. The way some folks crossed the street when they saw her car. Every step closer to the truth made someone more uncomfortable. What really unsettled Marla was how quickly people, with nothing to hide, were now going quiet. Cheryl, once eager to help, stopped returning calls. Lisa's sister Rachel reported that someone had been watching her house from a parked car late at night. Even Daniel's brother, who had always been the most vocal about seeking justice, asked Marla if maybe it was time to let the past stay buried. That wasn't like him. Something was scaring people, and that fear felt recent. Marla doubled down. She requested access to the original evidence boxes stored at the old county facility. The files were dusty, faded, some water damage, but one manila folder stood out. It had notes from the very first officer on the scene when the couple was reported missing. In the margins, someone had written a line that caught her eye. Anonymous tip came in night of June 15th. Told dispatch to search McCaskill's Pond. It had been crossed out and never followed up on. McCaskill's Pond was the one where the car was found. Why had that lead been ignored? Marla pulled phone records from that night. There was a 2 a.m. call logged to dispatch, traced back to a number listed under a landline now belonging to an abandoned farmhouse south of town. No one had lived there since the late 80s. She drove out there the next day. The house was in pieces, roof caved in, ivy swallowing the walls, but out back she found something unexpected. A rusted metal drum buried in the soil, just slightly exposed. She called it in. Inside were waterlogged papers, a melted flashlight, and an old cassette tape labeled with a date. June 12, 1985. When the lab restored it, they were able to make out fragments. A man's voice, tense, urgent. "If she doesn't back off, I swear I'll take care of it myself." Static. Then a softer voice, possibly a woman's, saying, "She's getting married. It's done. Leave her alone." Another pause. Then, "You don't understand. He wasn't supposed to be with her." Marla listened to that tape over and over. It wasn't clear who was speaking, but the second voice could have been Lisa, and the first. It wasn't Daniel. The words burned into Marla's mind. He wasn't supposed to be with her. The tape seemed to confirm something more personal was at play. Someone had a problem with the marriage. Someone who thought Lisa had chosen the wrong man. The next lead came from a completely unexpected place. A woman named Nadine, who had recently moved back to town after 20 years away, called in after seeing the news about the reopened case. She used to be friends with a man named Kyle Foster, the same ex-boyfriend of Lisa that Marla had tried and failed to locate earlier. Nadine said Kyle had shown up on her doorstep in 1992, out of the blue. He looked thin, paranoid, said he needed to talk, but left before he could explain. She remembered him saying just one strange thing: "I never meant for her to die." She hadn't understood it then, but now she was terrified that it had something to do with Lisa. Nadine never saw him again. This cracked the case wide open in Marla's mind. It wasn't just about a wedding night disappearance. It was about obsession, regret, and someone who hadn't moved on. She began pulling records on Kyle again, this time digging deeper. That's when she discovered something new. Kyle had applied for a name change in 1991. Under a different county. New identity, new start. The name on the application: Charles Danner. It clicked like a switch being flipped. Marla had seen that name before in the old property sale records of the land surrounding the pond. The buyer in 1993. Charles Danner. He had owned the very pond where Lisa and Daniel's car had been submerged, and he'd bought it 8 years after the wedding. The tension inside Marla reached a breaking point. She was convinced now whoever this man had become, he had orchestrated something. Maybe not the full disappearance, maybe not the deaths, but he knew what happened. He knew where they were, but finding him was proving harder than ever. His trail vanished again in 2004. No address, no phone. Just the property title sitting in a holding company's name. It looked deliberate. Someone had made sure to stay hidden. Marla started watching the land, day and night. She set up cameras in the trees, planted motion sensors. She waited, and then, one foggy morning, something moved. A figure in a hoodie, tall, moving along the edge of the pond. He was digging, not far from where the Thunderbird had been found. When he left, she retrieved what he'd buried, a sealed box. Inside, old photos, letters, and one wedding program from Lisa and Daniel's ceremony. The back of it had writing. Scrawled in red ink, "You shouldn't have said yes." Whoever this was, he hadn't just followed them. He had planned something for a long time, and now, after all these years, he was back. Marla felt it in her bones. The story wasn't over. Someone was still out there, watching. And whatever happened that night in 1985 was never meant to be found. Marla sat alone in the darkened records room, the grainy VHS footage playing for the 5th time. Each time she watched it, she caught something new. The way Lisa paused before stepping into the car. The flicker of fear in her eyes, like she'd sensed something. And the shadowy figure who stepped out of the woods. The frame was too dark to make out a face, but his posture, his build, was familiar. What shook her more was the figure crouched in the corner behind the bushes, half hidden and motionless. A child. The camera angle only caught her for a moment, but it was long enough. Rachel. That night, she hadn't just looked out a window. She'd followed them. She saw what happened, and someone had seen her too. Marla drove to Rachel's house with a pounding heart. When Rachel opened the door, she looked like she hadn't slept. She didn't even ask why Marla was there. She just stepped aside. Inside, Rachel sat at the edge of her couch, hands clasped. "You found the tape," she said quietly. Marla nodded. "You were there. Not just watching. You followed them." Rachel exhaled sharply, eyes filling. "I didn't mean to. I was scared. I thought Lisa was in danger, and I wanted to make sure she was okay. I followed them out through the back gate. I saw everything. But I didn't understand it then. I was just a kid." Marla leaned forward. "Tell me what you saw." Rachel's voice trembled as she spoke. They stopped near the turnoff by the pond. The man in the other car, he came out yelling. Lisa got out first, tried to calm him down. Daniel followed, confused. Then there was pushing, arguing. The man hit Daniel hard. He went down. Lisa screamed. Marla didn't interrupt. She could feel the air getting heavier. Then Lisa ran back toward the car. Rachel said, eyes glassy. But the man grabbed her. He pulled something out. I don't know what it was. I just heard Lisa say, "Don't do this. It's over." Then he forced her into the passenger seat and got behind the wheel. Marla's breath caught. He drove the car. Rachel nodded slowly. He drove it toward the pond. I thought he was trying to hide them or scare them. I don't know. But I saw him put the car in neutral, and he just let it roll. Right into the water. Then he turned and walked away, like it meant nothing. There was silence between them, the kind that can only settle after the truth has been pulled out from the deepest corner of memory. Marla finally asked, "Who was it?" Rachel didn't speak. She walked over to an old box in the corner of the room. From inside, she pulled out a photo. One Marla hadn't seen before. It was Lisa and Kyle Foster, taken years before the wedding. They were teenagers, arms around each other, smiling. But scrawled in the corner, almost too faint to see, was the name Charles Danner. Rachel said he changed his name. He came back years later. Told me if I ever said anything, he'd make sure I ended up like them. Marla felt a chill crawl down her spine. Kyle had disappeared in '92, changed identities, bought the land with the pond, and had been watching, hiding, possibly even living near Oak Ridge all this time. She moved fast. Warrants were filed. The cabin in the woods was searched again, this time more thoroughly. Hidden under floorboards, officers found journals, maps, and another box, this one filled with mementos from Lisa and Daniel's wedding. He'd been collecting pieces of their lives, keeping them. The final break came that night. A tip came. From a nearby county, someone matching Charles Danner's description had been admitted to a hospital after a car accident. A routine ID check set off an alert, and within hours, Marla arrived to confront the man behind it all, in the hospital. Bed, gaunt and bandaged. He looked nothing like the old photos, but his eyes, those cold, familiar eyes, gave him away. Marla said nothing. She just played the audio from the old cassette tape. He closed his eyes, and for the first time, showed fear. With Charles Danner in custody, the case that had haunted Oak Ridge for over a decade finally had a name. The man who never let go. The man who couldn't accept that Lisa had moved on. But even as answers came pouring in, one last twist remained. While combing through Danner's belongings, officers found a stack of letters, since never opened. One was addressed to Rachel. Inside was a note. "You saw too much, but you saw it wrong," and taped to the back. A photograph not of Lisa and Daniel, but of Rachel. Taken recently, watching Marla, the last twist came crashing down like thunder. Rachel hadn't just been a witness. She had stayed in touch with Danner over the years, fearfully at first, then reluctantly. It had started with silence, then guilt, then protection. She hadn't buried the box out of panic. She had buried it too. Distract Marla, to shift attention, to keep herself safe. Marla stood in the center of the station, files in her hands, and realized that this wasn't just about a man obsessed with a woman he couldn't have. It was also about the cost of silence, of loyalty twisted by fear. Rachel had seen the truth and carried it like a secret scar for years. But in trying to hide one monster, she had helped keep the story buried now. It was all out, and Oak Ridge would never be the same. Marla stared at the wedding program in her hands, the red ink still damp from the morning dew. The words "you shouldn't have said yes" code in her mind, like a threat frozen in time. It wasn't just creepy handwriting or some forgotten memento. It was a message, one that had been hidden, buried, and recently returned to the surface by someone who clearly wasn't done with the past, someone who had come back. She locked the box in evidence and reviewed the footage from the trail cameras. The figure was too far away to identify, tall, hooded, moving with purpose, not random, not a trespasser. This person knew exactly where to dig, and they'd buried that box just hours before she found it. That meant they were close. Maybe watching. Marla expanded the search area around the pond, brought in dogs, asked nearby properties for any private security footage. The area was thick with woods. But there was an old maintenance road that cut through the Baca Road that hadn't been marked on public maps since the 70s. It led straight to a cluster of abandoned cabins. Most were rotted through, but one looked recently disturbed. The door wasn't locked. Inside, it was mostly empty, except for a single chair and a wall lined with old photos. Some were water-stained, curled at the edges. But the faces were unmistakable. Lisa, Daniel, their friends. Snapshots from school dances, cookouts, and birthdays. Marla stepped closer. That's when she saw it. One photo, different from the rest. A black and white print from a surveillance camera. It showed her standing at the pond, taken just a week ago. Her skin chilled. This wasn't just a case anymore. It was personal. But the real twist came later that day. A forensic analyst called her back with updates on the fingerprints lifted from the box. Most were smudged or partial. But one came back clear. It wasn't Kyle Foster or Charles Danner. It belonged to someone else. Someone already in the system. Someone still living in Oak Ridge. The print matched Rachel Mayfield, Lisa's younger sister. Marla didn't want to believe it. Rachel had always seemed sincere, emotional, broken, but cooperative. She'd shared memories, even fears. But she had also said she hadn't touched anything. She claimed she hadn't been back to the wedding site in years, so how did her fingerprint end up on a box buried at a crime scene? Marla didn't confront her right away. Instead, she watched Rachel's routines, her home, who she talked to. And within days, something else turned up: phone records showing Rachel had made several calls in the last 6 months to a number registered under a different name. She'd called the same number the night before the box was found. When Marla traced the number, it led to a prepaid burner phone. But the phone had pinged a nearby tower at 3 a.m. the same morning the hooded figure was seen at the pond. The pieces were starting to collide in ways Marla hadn't expected. What if Rachel hadn't been telling the full truth? What if she knew more than she let on, not out of guilt, but out of protection or fear? Then, out of nowhere, an envelope arrived at the sheriff's office. No return address, no postmark. Inside was a single photograph: Lisa and Rachel on the porch, taken just days before the wedding. On the back, more writing. Ask her what she saw that night, the night of the wedding, not before, not after. That night, Marla drove straight to Rachel's house. Rachel looked exhausted, like she hadn't slept in days. When Marla showed her the photo, her hands trembled. She sat down slowly, as if her legs couldn't carry the weight of what she'd been holding in for years. "I didn't mean to lie," she whispered. "I just didn't know if it mattered anymore." Marla waited. Rachel finally spoke. "Night after the wedding, I couldn't sleep. I heard something. Voices. I looked out the window and saw Lisa and Daniel pulled over on the side of the road. Another car had stopped behind them. A man got out. I didn't recognize him, but Lisa did. She got out too. They were arguing. I saw Lisa push him. Then he grabbed her arm." Rachel paused, her eyes glassing over. "I wanted to run out there. But I was just a kid. I was scared. So I ran to get Mom. By the time we came back, they were gone." Marla asked why she never told anyone. Rachel broke down. "Because Mom made me promise not to. She said it was probably nothing. That if the police heard it, they'd accuse Lisa of cheating or running away. She didn't want that kind of talk." And then days passed, then years. And it felt too late. But there was something off. Rachel's story felt too smooth, too rehearsed, so Marla asked one more question. "How did your fingerprint end up on that box?" Rachel froze. "I didn't dig it up," she said, too quickly. I found it in the woods once, years ago. I looked inside, then left it. I didn't bury it." But Marla wasn't sure what to believe anymore. The story had changed again. And the lines between witness, victim, and suspect were beginning to blur. Meanwhile, across town, another storm was brewing. The owner of the original venue, now an elderly man, came forward with something he said he'd found in an old storage bin when cleaning out his office. It was a VHS tape, labeled simply, "Reception Camera 3. He handed it to Marla, and on that tape, unseen by any previous investigation, was a shot from the rear parking lot of the wedding. The last few moments before Daniel and Lisa drove away, and just as they pulled out, headlights flashed from a vehicle parked in the trees. A figure stepped forward, face hidden by shadow. But behind him, barely visible in the corner of the frame, was someone else, a young girl. Watching from the bushes, it wasn't just Lisa and Daniel who had witnessed something that night. Someone else saw it too, and they weren't alone. In the days that followed the arrest, Oak Ridge began to exhale. It wasn't immediate, and it wasn't complete. But there was something in the air that hadn't been there for 12 years closure. People stopped whispering at the diner and started talking. The name Lisa Mayfield was spoken again with warmth, not hesitation. And Daniel Whitaker, once just the smiling groom on a lost wedding photo, was finally remembered the way he deserved to be. As a good man who'd loved fiercely and died tragically trying to protect the woman he loved, Detective Marla Griggs stood at the edge of Mackascal's Pond, now cordoned off for environmental review. A sign had been placed by the sheriff's office not to memorialize the crime, but to honor the lives lost. Flowers were already tucked beneath the wooden frame, left quietly by neighbors, old classmates, even strangers. The yellow thunderbird had long since been removed, but the image of it resting just beneath the surface, untouched for over a decade, stayed in everyone's mind. It had become more than a car, was a time capsule of grief, love, and unanswered questions. At the station, Rachel Mayfield gave a full, voluntary statement. She didn't try to make excuses. She admitted she had been afraid not just of Kyle Foster, now known as Charles Danner, but of what the truth might do to her family. After their parents died, Rachel had held tightly to what little she had left of Lisa, and in her young mind, staying silent had seemed like the only way to protect that memory. As years went by, the weight grew too heavy. She'd buried that box in hopes someone else would find it, so she wouldn't have to speak the words herself. But the moment the truth started crawling back into the light, she realized silence had only protected the wrong person. No charges were filed against her. Marla made that call herself. Rachel hadn't killed anyone. She had been a child when it all happened, a scared teenager later manipulated by a man who thrived on control. Court agreed. Instead of punishment, Rachel was offered counseling and witness protection for a time, just in case any other ties to Danner remained hidden. She didn't ask for forgiveness, but many in town gave it anyway. Sometimes survival makes you do things you can't explain until it's far too late. Charles Danner, meanwhile, remained in custody, facing multiple charges, including 2 counts of second-degree murder, obstruction, and evidence tampering. Though he initially refused to talk, he eventually confessed in part during a recorded interview. He said Lisa was never supposed to choose Daniel, that she had promised to come back to him. But when she didn't, he followed her. He saw them leave the reception that night. He knew the route. He waited near the pond. His voice on tape remained cold, emotionless, more concerned with being heard than being understood. The story made regional headlines. Cold case wedding mystery solved after 12 years. Read one article. Others called it the yellow car in the pond case. And one headline, perhaps the most accurate, read simply, "Small town secrets finally told." For some, it was a curiosity. For Oak Ridge, it was healing. Marla didn't take much credit, though others gave it to her. She'd followed her instincts, sure, but she knew that what really solved the case was the people, the small moments, the whispered doubts, the memories that lingered in dusty shoeboxes and old VHS tapes. Every piece mattered, even the ones people thought were too small to be useful. She realized then that solving cold cases wasn't just about forensics or files. It was about listening to the silences and knowing when a missing word meant more than what was said out loud. The old venue where Lisa and Daniel were married hosted a community memorial that fall. The town came together under the same wooden arch they had once stood beneath, this time not for celebration, but for remembrance. Friends read letters. Cousin played a song Daniel had loved. And at the very end, Rachel stood quietly before the crowd and placed Lisa's Velda, same one that had rested in her lap inside the car, and a small wooden cross placed at the edge of the property. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Life in Oak Ridge slowly returned to normal. But it wasn't the same. Not in a bad way, just different. Like a long winter finally giving way to spring. The empty spaces once filled with questions now had stories. Painful ones, yes, but stories people could share instead of just wonder about. Marla eventually cleared her office wall. The red string came down. The old maps were rolled up and filed. The photo of Lisa and Daniel remained, though not as evidence, but as a reminder of why she started in the first place. She'd seen too many families live with what-ifs. Too many towns pretend that time alone could heal things. Silence couldn't. But this case taught her something else too, that the truth always finds its way to the surface, no matter how long it stays buried. As fall turned to winter, the leaves around McCaskill's pond began to fall, revealing more of the land that had once hidden the truth. The water level dipped, the soil dried, and nature seemed to move on. But anyone who stood there for a while could still feel its presence of a story finally told. In the end, it wasn't about how they died. It was about how they were remembered. Lisa and Daniel weren't just a headline anymore. They were two people who had been loved, who had dreamed of a life together, and whose final moments were finally understood. That mattered more than anything. And somewhere beyond the noise and the loss, that quiet matters most. Their story, once vanished like a whisper, was now heard loud and clear.